When we classify triangles, we're going to classify them by their angles and by their sides. When we classify them by their angles, we have acute triangles, which have 3 acute angles, so 3 angles that are less than 90 degrees. All 3 angles will be less than 90 degrees. When we have a right triangle, we have 1 angle that's exactly 90 degrees. The other 2 angles will be acute because they have to add up to equal 180 degrees. When we have an obtuse triangle, we have 1 angle that is obtuse, and obtuse means greater than, so it's greater than 90 degrees. And the other 2 angles will be acute. When we classify them according to their sides, we have a scalene triangle, which has 3 sides that are not congruent to each other. And we know that if the number of sides that are congruent is the same as the number of angles that are congruent in a triangle. So no sides are congruent, therefore no angles are congruent. With an isosceles triangle, 2 sides are congruent, therefore 2 angles are congruent. And with an equilateral triangle, 3 sides are congruent, therefore 3 angles are congruent. The next thing we need to understand is that in an isosceles triangle, the 2 angles that are congruent to each other are opposite the congruent sides. And this is really important because it's not very obvious on some isosceles triangles. So if you look at this triangle right here, you'll see that we have 2 sides congruent to each other, and the angles that are congruent to each other are in red. These are the angles that are across from the congruent sides. Those are the 2 angles that are congruent to each other. Another way to think about it is that the angle that's not congruent, the angle that's not congruent is the one where the 2 congruent sides meet. So when the 2 congruent sides come up here to meet, they form an angle that's not congruent to the others. So here we can see we have 3 different triangles that are all isosceles, and the way that you identify the angles that are congruent to each other is by looking at the angles across from the congruent sides. If that's a difficult way to visualize, what you can do is you can follow the congruent sides until they intersect each other, and that is the angle that's not congruent to any of the other angles. So you can see in this picture, this third one, these 2 sides intersect at this angle down here. Therefore, that one is not congruent to the other 2. Therefore, this one and this one are congruent to each other. This is just another diagram going through all the details of what we know about our different types of triangles. We know that the interior angles of our triangles, or the angles of our triangles, all 3 angles will always add up to 180 degrees. That's really important. We know that a scalene triangle, here we're classifying by sides, scalene triangle has no sides congruent, therefore no angles congruent. An isosceles triangle has 2 sides congruent, therefore 2 angles congruent. Equilateral triangle, 3 sides congruent, therefore 3 angles congruent. Now, with an equilateral triangle, since all 3 angles are congruent, we know how much they equal. An acute triangle has a triangle with 3 acute angles. A right triangle has a triangle with only 1 right angle. And an obtuse triangle has a triangle with only 1 obtuse angle. Now we're going to drag all the triangles that meet each description. You're going to rotate the triangles to show clearly how they fit the given description. So each one of these triangles, you're going to classify by both the sides and the angles. So in other words, we're going to drag one of these, or each of these, twice. So for example, B is going to be isosceles, so I'm going to drag that down under isosceles. So that's based on its sides. So we figured out what it is based on its sides, but let's see if we can tell what it is based on its angles. This one's also acute, so I'm also going to drag it under acute. So here we have acute, obtuse, and right for the 3 types based on angles, and scalene, isosceles, and equilateral for the 3 types based on their